Hello and welcome to another crochet tutorial video. I am here to talk to you about how to make your very own Eurus men's pullover, which is a part of the wind sweater collection that I've put out this year. And it is the third one in the collection, which makes this the intermediate challenge level. So this is where we get to really flex our crochet skills and start practicing transitioning from some of those basic easy techniques and moving them into a more advanced set. So just be prepared. There are going to be some very challenging moments, but in the pattern that you can get for purchase, you will get tips on how to make choices, how to make things a little easier. If you want to really go up for a challenge, you can do that. I do provide guidance in those. Plus, you also have this video to help you with any of the things that might prove to be a little too difficult at first. But if you do persevere, I do find that this is one of my favorite sweaters in this collection, simply because it does have a very fun texture. I'm just going to show you an example right here. I'm still making my version here, and it's got this lovely seed stitch pattern here that we're going to go over. But yeah, anyway, that's enough me bragging on the sweater. Let's get started on what you're going to need. So the first thing we'll need to do is pick out some yarn. So I've got here a Chick That Knits yarn. This is a hand dyer out of Oklahoma, where I live, and this is the Silky Singles. So this is a 70% merino wool, 30% silk blend here. It is a fingering weight yarn. It comes in 438 yards per 100 grams. It is super silky, beautiful, buttery soft, and it's got like a lovely squish, and it's really lightweight and warm at the same time and feels really good up against the skin. The color I'm using for this version is Desert Rose, but obviously use whatever color you would like to use for your own. Obviously, you're going to also need some hooks. So for this sweater, as well as all the other sweaters in this collection, I'm using two different sized hooks. I'm using a size USC, which is a 2.75 millimeter for the main stitching. You'll use whatever size you need to be able to match the gauge. But then I also use a size B. This is a 2.25 millimeter. This is my smallest hook I have, and I use that whenever I get to any of the ribbing, such as for the collar, the cuffs, and the hem on the bottom, because I like that ribbing to be just a little tighter, so it just cinches in and creates a nice polished look. You can get away with using any size hook throughout. Like if you wanted to just stick with the C hook, you could do that. Just know that your ribbing may be a little on the looser side if you do that. The other things you're going to need are some notions. So the ones that I think are just pretty essential for any sweater is you're going to need a measuring tape of some kind so that you can measure not only yourself, but also the garment and making sure that you're matching gauge. You'll need some scissors for cutting. We are going to be working without any joining of new colors. So this is mostly just to cut any yarn when you join new yarn. And then you'll need a tapestry needle of some kind. I have some ones right here, and I just use those to weave in my loose ends. But then there's going to be a very critical notion that you cannot skip on this. So the Eurus sweater, one of the techniques we do is we talk about creating increases in the yoke, but we're going to kind of do something a little different with those increases than what we've done in the previous two sweaters, and that is going to be using two different sets of stitch markers. So I have here two sets here, very distinct from each other. So you're going to need two sets. You're going to need 12 of one set. So I've got my little kind of crystal bead looking ones here, and then 12 of another set. So I've got my plastic locking ones that you can usually get in any starter crochet or knitting kit. And then you'll want to have one or two unique ones to mark just like your first and maybe even your last stitch of your rounds, because that way you know when you get to the beginning, the end, things like that, and it's distinct from either one of these sets. So grand total, you're going to need 25 stitch markers, 12 of one for set A, 12 of one for set B, and then 1 stitch marker to mark the unique beginning of the round, possibly a 26th one if you want to use one for the beginning and the end. A final thing I don't have on here is going to be blocking mats and blocking pins. We are going to need to block our sweater because I think that that's just a good plan for any garment that you want to wear. It really opens up the stitches, really settles everything in, and it's a chance to be able to launder and put it into the measurements that we need. Now that we've got all of our supplies, we are ready to get started, and the first thing we need to do is our gauge swatch. For any sort of wearable project where fit is going to matter, you're definitely going to not want to skip this part, and that is making the gauge swatch. It is not the world's most exciting part, I'm not going to lie to you, but it is extremely important. And yeah, so here we go. So what I did is I worked up a gauge swatch of 36 half double crochets and 36 rows. That way I had plenty of room. And then I washed it, blocked it, and treated it like I would the actual garment. So that way I could see about where the stitches are going to be. Now, this is in a different color because I was using a different yarn color, but it's the exact same yarn fiber content, and it's the same brand and all of that, and it's the same yardage. So it's going to work up the same as the other one. So what you usually look for is you'll look for 4 inches. And in that 4 inches, you would go through and you would line it up with a stitch just wherever you can. And then every time you see a stitch followed by a gap, so a stitch followed by a gap, that counts as 1 stitch. So let me actually get a little bit closer here. Okay. So what you would do is you would count and see, okay, so we've got 1 stitch plus a gap, 1 stitch plus a gap, 1 stitch plus a gap. So each one of those is going to count as 1 stitch because each stitch takes up the space of that little post plus that gap. So you would count each of those spaces as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. You count them all the way until you get here to your 4-inch mark, or if you're using metric, you would use the 10-centimeter mark. And then you would try to see that you can match my gauge in the pattern as close as possible. And then you would do the same thing. You would turn it around. And then you would do the same thing for rows. So every time that there's one of these little dips in the rows, that's going to be 2 rows because the half double crochets look different on both sides. So every time you see one of those dips, it's 2. So you would go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, etc. till you hit 4 inches or 10 centimeters. The gauge for this project is 27 and a half double crochets by 25 rows in 4 inches or 10 centimeters. A way to kind of see that if you can match gauge is if you can do what is called wraps per inch. So I just have this little cheapy wooden tool that I got, but you can just use any hard plastic ruler or hard wooden ruler and just wrap your yarn around. But what that means is that if you were to take your yarn and you were to start over at 0 and you start wrapping it, not too tightly, but definitely want to make sure that it's snug on there so that all of the yarn is right next to each other. And if you can do that, you want to try to get as close to the wraps per inch that I have, because then you have a better chance of being able to meet gauge with a similar yarn. Now, if you find that this is just too much of an extra step, most people don't even take the time to do this. This is just, whenever I'm looking for yarn, I tend to look at the weight and the number of yards per gram. And that kind of gives me a good guide. But then I'll also kind of go that little bit of an extra mile and be like, hey, how many wraps per inch does this actually come out to? Because that's going to be more important than like the yarn weight, the yardage, and say if it's like a fingering weight or a medium weight, because there's variations within even those categories. So like a fingering weight yarn can be 18 wraps per inch, or it could be 21 wraps per inch, or something like that. And you're like, those are going to make huge differences in how big your stitches and rows are going to be. So if I do that and wrap it around like this, nice and snug here, not too stretched, not too tight or anything, I could count through and find that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. This is about 23 wraps per inch. I think it's actually about like 22 is what I've seen like on the label or when I've done it before. So around 22, 23 wraps per inch. So if your yarn is close to that, like within about 1 wrap per inch above or below, you're probably going to be just fine. The other thing you'll have to take into account is whether or not you are a tight crocheter or a loose crocheter, because regardless of your yarn weight, if you crochet really tight, you might have a smaller gauge than me, so you might have to go up a hook size. And if you crochet pretty loose, you might have to go lower in hook size. So, you just have to play around with that, experiment with it, take the time, really just enjoy crocheting your swatches until you get it right, because you definitely don't want to spend all that time making a sweater for it to turn out to be the wrong size. So yeah, there you go. So that is everything you need to know about gauge. So now, once you're done with your gauge swatch and you figured all that out, you are ready to get started on your actual Zephyr sweater. To begin our Eurus pullover, we are going to start with our smaller hook if you want to get that tighter ribbing like me. So I'm starting with my B 2.75 millimeter, and we're just going to begin by making the collared ribbing. So to do that, we're going to start by making a slip knot, placing that on our hook if it doesn't get away from me there. There we go. And then what we're going to do is chain a total of 6 chains. Then in the second chain from our hook, we are going to work a half double crochet. So we yarn over, insert into that second chain from hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. And then we will work a half double crochet into each chain across, giving us a grand total of 5 half double crochets. Once we have those 5 half double crochets, we're going to turn our work, and then we will do a chain 1. And then to create the ribbing, what we're going to do is work in the back loops only. So just like with the other sweaters, we've been able to do a nice little ribbing here by finding our top loops here. So we've got our this little V at the top of each of our stitches. The back loop is the one that is farthest away from us, and then the front loop is the one closest. So we're going to be working into this back loop right here, working half double crochets in each stitch across. So we yarn over, go through that back loop there, pull up our loop, yarn over, pull through all 3. And we just do that into the back loop of each stitch across, giving us 5 half double crochets again. Then what we'll do is go ahead and turn and chain 1, and then just repeat that second row over and over again for the number of rows that it states in our pattern for our size. And that way it'll give us a nice long collar that will eventually wrap around, and it will create the opening of the neck of our sweater. So once I've done that, I'll just go right, yarn over, go through the back loop, half double crochet, back loop, half double crochet, and I should always have my 5 stitches. Now at this point you could customize how you want to do the collar. I'm just doing a short little ribbed collar for a nice crew neck look, but if you wanted to do something like a turtleneck, or you wanted to make it long and then fold it over and sew it in to make like kind of a double folded collar, I've seen that is very stylish for a lot of sweaters. You could do that as well. If you just want a thicker collar in general, not necessarily a turtleneck or anything, but just a thicker collar, you could just add a few more chains, and then that's your new stitch count. So you can really customize this part of your sweater however you want for the type of style that you're going for. But in either case, the instructions are pretty much the same. You make a chain, starting in the second chain from your hook, you will half double crochet across, then chain 1, turn, half double crochet, back loop only, and then just keep repeating that with a number of rows for your size. Now it'll be pretty boring to watch me just continue working half double crochets in the back loop only. I want to just show you here. We do get that nice little ridging going here, but I'm not going to work all of that up on camera. So I'm going to work the rest of my collar off camera for my sample, and then you're going to do the same thing, and then I will meet you back to show you how you join the collar together. All right, I've worked up my collar sample here. So you can see we've got this nice stretchy ribbing with all our half double crochets in the back loop, and we're now ready to join them to form our neck opening. All right, so to form our neck opening, the first thing we're going to need to do is go ahead and turn, and we're actually going to go ahead and chain one, just like we're about to start a new row. But rather than doing another row in the back loop, what we're actually going to do is take our collar and we're going to fold it to where the last row we just made lines up on top of the first row that we made, just like this. And what that'll do is give us a very nice continuation of this ridge pattern for our ribbing. And this is going to be how we're going to join it. So you'll find our very first stitch right here. We would normally have worked through the back loop here on top, but we're actually going to go through the front of the stitch here. So on half double crochets, we're going to see this little V thing right here on the side. That's where we're going to insert our hook, is into that V and under both loops of this first stitch. But then we're also going to find this first loop opening, this chain that we worked in the first row, and insert our hook through that as well. Once we do that, we then take our yarn over with our hook, and then we are going to slip stitch all of that together. So we're just going to go through the first loop of the first row, the first stitch of this last row, and the loop on our hook all at once. So just grab our yarn and pull it all the way through. If we need to, we can take it one step at a time and just pull it through one at a time. But in either case, you're going to get it all the way through here. And then that joins the first stitch together. Then we just do that again into the second, third, fourth, and fifth stitches, or however many stitches that you made yours wide. So we'll find this second stitch right here, insert our hook into both loops there, find the second open chain here from our first row, and insert our hook into there. And then we will yarn over and then slip stitch all of that together. And there we go. And then you just do that all the way across. So there's my third one. Third one here. Yarn over and slip stitch through all of it. Then my fourth one. And then finally my fifth one. Now if you find that you are not exactly matching up perfectly stitch to stitch, or off by maybe one, even two stitches, that's perfectly fine. You just kind of fudge this part. As long as you are joining it evenly across, then you should be good, even if you're off by a couple of stitches. And if you do find that it doesn't look as good as you want it to, that's okay. You just take your hook out, undo it, and then start over again. But then what you'll get is this nice join here, just like that, where the ribbing just continues just like it looks on the rest of this. So then that way it's a lot better, more like a seamless look than if we joined it a different way. All right, so now that we've done that, we've got our collar here. So a good idea is to go ahead and take your collar at this point and stretch it over your head just to see, does it go over the head and then go around the neck comfortably. Now keep in mind that it's meant to stretch when it goes over the head. It's not meant to be super loose. So if you do have to stretch it to get over, that's fine, as long as it snaps back and feels comfortable. If you find that it is still too tight, you may have to go back and either go up a hook size just to make it looser, or add a few more extra rows if you don't want to do all of that. But keep in mind that if you add those extra rows, this next part, you're going to have to make some adjustments and do some like row skipping every once in a while to account for the fact that you have more rows than what the pattern has written for, just so you know. All right, so now that we've done that, it is time for us to begin working our first round of our yoke. So to begin the yoke part, what we're going to do is actually switch out, if you used a different hook, with our C hook or whatever one you're using for your main gauge. And we're going to insert that into our loop here. And one thing you want to keep in mind is that because of how we did the join, what's actually happening is that when we turn our work to see the right side, the yarn is actually kind of coming through the inside of our collar here. So all we have to do is just make sure that we grab our yarn and pull it through the collar so that it's on the outside instead of going through the inside of this tube here. So once we pull it through, we're going to see that our yarn is now coming from the back of our work here, but it's no longer going inside of this collar. If you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, you'll pretty much see what's happening if you start making your yoke and you're like, wait a minute, the yarn's kind of feeding a weird way. You'll just naturally be able to kind of push it through the tube of your neck and get it fixed. All right, so now that we have our new hook here, we are going to begin by finding, oh, sorry, this tail is just getting in my way here. Get that out. Okay. We're going to see that each one of our ribs contains a ridge, which is this part that's kind of popping out right here. So this part right here, this part right here. And then it's going to contain a groove in between each ridge. So that's going to be these two ridges here. The groove is this kind of dip that goes in like that. And then there's another groove right here. So each one of these ridges is popping up and each groove is in between going down. So what it'll say in your pattern is that you're going to work a half double crochet into the very first ridge that we just joined into. And this is not an exact thing. You just kind of find a place to insert your hook. So we're going to go ahead and yarn over, find something in this ridge kind of here towards the top, and we're just going to shove our hook in. And there we go. Once we do that, we will yarn over, pull up a loop, and then we will yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on our hook. After we work that first one, we're now going to work 2 half double crochets into each groove. So remember that the grooves are these sections that are between these kind of ridges. Well, at the tops of each one, we can see that there's kind of almost like 2 little holes right here. One that's kind of on the side of this ridge that we just worked into, and one that's kind of on the side of this ridge. Or there might be this one kind of in the middle. It's really up to you however you want to do it. But I just kind of pick 2 random spots in that groove and I work a half double crochet in each one. So I'll just yarn over, I'll go into this part of this groove, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 3. And then I go into this next one, yarn over, insert into that part of the groove, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 3. And what that does is it works 1 stitch in each ridge, 2 stitches in each groove. So it's actually going to increase the number of stitches 1.5 times around. So if you're not like, what do you mean by that? It's like, you know what? It doesn't matter. The point is that if you follow along by doing 1 in each ridge and 2 in each groove, you should get the right stitch count listed for your size. So let's go through that again here. We're going to yarn over this ridge. We're just going to kind of insert our hook into some stitch here in the ridge. Does not really matter where. Pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 3. So there's 1 in the ridge. And then in the groove, we're just going to work 2. Yarn over, maybe go into this first one kind of here to the groove of the groove on the right. And then yarn over and go through this gap right here on the left part of the groove. And there we go. So there was 1 and then 2. And then you just do 1 in the ridge, followed by 2 in the groove. And you just do that all the way around. And then once we get all the way around, I'm going to join you and show you how to join the round with what's called the invisible join. I just finished working all the way around the collar of my sample, and you should have the same number of stitches as listed in your pattern. If not, you can kind of adjust a couple of places and just kind of add in a stitch or take out a stitch as needed. But in either case, once I get around here to the end, I actually have not worked up my final stitch quite yet, because when we do our final stitch, we're going to do something a little different to join into this first stitch. So what we're going to do is what's called the invisible join. Now, it's kind of a misnomer. It's not exactly invisible, but it gets as close to invisible as you can, especially once you launder and block your sweater later. But it does make it a little bit less conspicuous than if I just joined with the normal slip stitch like in the previous sweater patterns. So what you do to do the invisible join is you go ahead and start your stitch like normal. So I'm going to start my final half double crochet. I will go into this last groove here, pull up my loop. Then, before you finish your stitch by doing your final pull over and closing it, you're actually going to go behind the yarn and behind all these stitches, find your very first stitch here, and you're going to go from the back through that first stitch underneath both of these loops. So we've come from the back, behind our yarn, behind the stitches, and into that first stitch into those 2 loops. Then what we're going to do is what's called a yarn under. So normally when I work crochet, I'll usually go yarn over where the yarn goes over my hook. But this case, because my hook is over this yarn, I'm actually going to just grab it from the top instead of trying to wrap it around and grab it like this. It's adding extra twist that I don't even need. So once I'm ready, I'll grab my yarn and carefully pull it through the stitch and through the 3 loops of my half double crochet. And then what that does is it pulls the last stitch here towards the front of our work here. And then when we turn our work, we're going to turn it to where we turn the work counterclockwise or turn the hook clockwise. So let's kind of demonstrate that slowly here. We're going to turn the work this way counterclockwise, and then our hook has turned clockwise like this. What this does is it's pulling this strand of yarn around this way so that when it's time for us to begin working our next row, it's to the back here. And then when we work our very first stitch, it actually kind of hides it inside the stitch. And I'll show you what I mean by that here. I'll yarn over, create my half double crochet in this first one, pull up a loop, and then yarn over and pull through. And we can see that it pulls this yarn into that stitch. And then on the front, it looks like the rest of the stitches. It just kind of looks like another loop coming out of this one, just like all the other stitches have a loop coming out of it. And so it helps kind of blend that together, and it's not as obvious that that's where our join is. If you find that that is a little too difficult, just like with anything else in this intermediate pattern, you can always scale back. You can just go back, and instead of doing the invisible join, you could just work your final stitch like normal, and then just join with the slip stitch. So you just insert your hook into that first stitch of the round, yarn over and slip stitch and pull through everything, just making sure you kind of pull it a little tight so that that little joining slip stitch isn't as obvious. Now, this doesn't create as smooth of a join. It does make it a little bit more obvious because you're going to see these kind of little small bumps throughout the seam. But then when you turn, you'll still just work like normal. but make sure you don't accidentally work into that slip stitch. So if you do the slip stitch method, make sure you don't count that as a stitch. If you do the invisible method, there won't be a random extra loop that will look like a stitch. It'll just all be 2 stitches joined together. So now that I've shown you the invisible join, it's time for us to begin the next round of our yoke. To begin the next round, we're actually not going to be doing any crocheting. Instead, we're going to have to place stitch markers. So this is where I talked earlier about stitch markers being very critical for this pattern, because that's going to mark the points where we will be increasing our yoke so that it grows out so that we can get it over the shoulders. So we're going to pull our stitch markers here. So I've got my set A stitch markers. And I've got my set B stitch markers right here. And then I have one unique stitch marker that's going to mark the beginning of my round. So one of the first things I'll do is go ahead and count out, and it'll tell you in your pattern where to count out all of your set A stitch markers. So it'll say, like, you know, in every 6th half double crochet or every 8th half double crochet or something like that. So for my sample here, I'm going to go every 20th stitch and place a set A stitch marker. So I'm just going to kind of find my first stitch here. So there's 1, 2, 3, and then there's stitch number 20. So in stitch number 20, I'm going to place a set A stitch marker. And there we go. And then I just do that again. 1, 2, 3. There's my next one. And then if I've done it right, my very last one should be in the last stitch of the round. So my next 20, 19, and 20 is in fact this very last stitch. Now my sample obviously has way fewer stitch markers than yours is going to. Every size is going to have 12 set A stitch markers spread evenly throughout, including one in the very last one. Then the next thing it'll tell you to do is find the halfway point between each of these stitch markers and place a set B stitch marker in between. So you could either just eyeball this, or if you really want to be precise, you can always kind of count out and divide by 2 and find a center stitch or whatever it is that method you want to do. For me, I'm okay with basically just kind of eyeballing it. So I might take like these 2 stitch markers here. So any 2 stitch markers you're wanting to go between. And you just kind of fold until they join, just like that. And then if you kind of crease it, you can eventually get up here to where you can find, okay, so that's about where the center is. So I'm going to go ahead and place the set B stitch marker into this stitch that was kind of right there where the fold happened. And that will get me halfway between these 2 stitch markers. And then I can do the same thing over here. Rather than counting it out, I just find these 2 stitch marked stitches and just kind of join them here, and then kind of fold, and then find, okay, so it's right about here. So that's going to be where I put my next one, right there. So there's my next set B stitch marker. And then I have one more. That's going to be between these 2 stitch marked stitches. You're obviously going to have 12 set B stitch markers since you have 12 set A ones. So there's going to be an equal number of each. And I'll go right about here. And there we go. And then the final stitch marker that we need to place is our unique one to mark the beginning of the round, because even though it will get to a point where it might be a little more obvious where the beginning of the round is, because we've got this last stitch marker in this last stitch, it's hard to tell if we didn't have these like yarn ends right here. It's kind of hard to tell where exactly the beginning would be. So we're like, okay, well, how do I know I've reached the end and all that stuff? So in the very first stitch of our round, right here, when we work our first stitch, we are going to place our first stitch marker. So I'm going to hold off on that until I actually do this. Now, once we know where we're going to be placing our stitch markers, it's time to start working in our established stitch pattern, which is going to be what's called the seed stitch. The established stitch pattern we will be working in is a half double crochet seed stitch, and I explain in the pattern that this is just alternating between working in the back loop and what's called the third loop. And depending on what side of the work we're on, you'll start one round using in the back loop, and then the next round you'll start using the third loop. So what I mean by that is that since we're on this second round, the second round is an even numbered round, so the second, the fourth, the sixth, so on and so forth, you're always going to be on the inside or the wrong side of our sweater. So that means we're going to start in the back loop of our half double crochets. So that's no different than when we worked our ribbing earlier. So you're just going to yarn over, go into the back loop of the first half double crochet, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all three. Your very first part of the seed stitch is completed, and this is the first stitch of our round. So we will go ahead and place our stitch marker, marking the beginning of our round. There we go. Now, since our first stitch was a back loop only one, the seed stitch means we need to alternate to the next one, not working in the back loop, but working what's called the third loop. So if we look at the top, we remember that we've got our back loop farthest away from us. We've got the front loop that's closest to us. But on a half double crochet, if we turn it away here, we can see on the front that there's this extra loop hanging out right here. That is the third loop. It's unique to half double crochet. So we're going to yarn over and we're going to work directly into that third loop. So to do that, we just slip our hook underneath that third loop, just grabbing that loop by itself, yarn over, pull up our loop, and then yarn over, pull through all three, and that's the next half double crochet completed. Then we just alternate. Going into the next one, we will work into the back loop. So we will yarn over, find the back loop of our next stitch, insert, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all three. And then the next one, we will work in our third loop. So we will yarn over, go through the front, under that third loop there, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through three. And you just keep alternating back and forth, working in the back loop, and then working in the third loop here on the front. All right. Once you establish that, you're just going to keep doing that all the way around until you reach your first set A stitch marker. So remember that the set A stitch markers for me are these little crystal bead ones. So you'll definitely want to make sure you remember which one is your set A and which one is your set B. For me, set B is going to be these plastic ones. So on this round, your first stitch marker is actually going to be a set B one. So we are not going to do anything into that one. We're just going to continue working seed stitch like normal. So we're going to continue working, back loop, then third loop, and then regardless of which one you reach, whether it's a back loop or a third loop one, when we reach the set B stitch marker, all we do is just take it out. I did a third loop one here, so the next one will be a back loop. So I'll yarn over, go into the back loop of this stitch, and then just place my set B stitch marker back into the one I just made. So that way it stays in the same spot. After that, we just continue until we get to our set A stitch marker. So that was in the back loop. So my next one is going to be in the third loop. So yarn over, go under that third loop on the front here. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to get in. It might be a little tight, but you just kind of finagle your hook under there and it should be good. Plus also, once we get this seed stitch established, it will be a lot easier to be able to work into the third loop because there's going to be a bit of a space underneath them that'll make it a lot easier to see and feel around and get your hook under. but this very first time doing it can be a bit tricky. You just keep alternating back loop, third loop, until we get to our set A stitch marker. All right, I have just now finished working the last stitch before I've reached my set A stitch marker. My last stitch here was worked in the back loop. So that means to do the next thing I'm about to do, I'm going to start by working in this third loop. Now what I mean by that is that we are about to do what's called a seed stitch increase. Now the seed stitch increase has two different versions depending on which way you need to start. So for my case, I need to start my increase in the front loop. So what we're going to do is do a front loop, then a back loop, then third loop, then a back loop, then a third loop, all in this same stitch, so that it creates an increase of 2 stitches into this one stitch. So I'm going to show that here. I'm going to go ahead and take out our stitch marker. And we're going to start by working a half double crochet into the third loop of that stitch. But then we're going to go behind here and find the back loop of that same stitch, and then we're going to work another half double crochet. So we'll yarn over, go into the back loop of the same stitch we just worked into, and create, oh, my yarn over came out. There we go. There we go. And then we will work into that back loop. Sorry if it keeps blurring in and out. I'm trying to keep it focused, but also make sure that like you can actually see what's going on. So I do apologize if I do have to like kind of shift to get it to look right. We'll pull up our loop here. So now we've worked a half double crochet in the third loop and in the back loop of the same stitch. Now we're going to work another half double crochet into the same third loop we worked into earlier. If you're not quite sure where that is, you can just kind of follow our path of stitches. You can see that we have this one that we just made in the back. This was the one we just made that was in the front, and it has its little leg things right here kind of coming out of this loop. That's the loop we're going to go back into. So we will yarn over, find that loop again. And what I sometimes had to do was I kind of used the hook part to kind of scoop underneath. So I came forward, kind of scooped underneath, and then it allowed me some room to kind of shove my hook in there. Do whatever technique you need to. You can do that, or if you can just go in with the point of your hook and just kind of force that third loop back up. But in either case, you want to make sure you're getting under the same third loop you worked into earlier and not the one on the next stitch, because we want to make sure we're working all in that same stitch. We'll yarn over, pull up a loop, then yarn over, pull through all 3. And it's going to be pretty crowded right in this one spot, but that's okay. It's meant to be. So what we've put into this one stitch is we worked our third loop half double crochet, followed by a back loop half double crochet, and then another third loop half double crochet, and it keeps that seed stitch pattern going while increasing our stitch count here by 2. Once we do that, we take our set A stitch marker, and we're going to place it into the center of that increase. So that would be this second one right here, the one we worked into the back loop. And then once we do that, we're ready to continue our pattern. So we ended by working a front loop half double crochet. So then we will work into the back loop on the next one. Yarn over, work the back loop, and then work front loop into the next one. Or third loop. Sorry, I keep saying front loop because it's on the front to me. The front loop is technically the one that's up here. So if I do say front loop, I'm really meaning third loop. So if that's confusing, I do apologize, but you are working only back loop, third loop. You're never actually working in this front loop of our half double crochet. So now that you've seen that, that is how you would work the rest of round 2, is you just repeat everything that we just did. So we would go seed stitch all the way around here. Work just a regular seed stitch in this set B stitch marker here. We're not doing any increasing there. Then continue the seed stitch pattern. And then once I reach the next set A stitch marker, I do an increase there. All right, I've just finished working all the way around and I'm about to work my final increase, which is going to be the last marked stitch with this set A stitch marker. But because this is the last stitch of the round, there's something else we're going to need to do, which is making sure we join with our invisible join into our first marked stitch here. So when we're doing our increase, of course, we'll figure out, did we work a back loop or a third loop half double crochet prior to that? In this case, I worked a back loop. So the increase I'm going to do here is going to start with a front loop. So I will, or sorry, third loop. So I'll go ahead and take that stitch marker out and then locate my third loop. So you can see here, I've got the tops of my stitch there. And if I turn it this way, the third loop is going to be kind of tucked right about in there. So I'm going to yarn over and insert my hook under that third loop here. And there we go. And then I will yarn over and pull up a loop and then finish my half double crochet. Then going behind it, I will find the back loop of this stitch and I'll work my next half double crochet in that one to increase. Then finish out by working another half double crochet in that third loop we worked into earlier. There we go. Now at this point, if you are just slip stitching to join and then turning, you can go ahead and finish this stitch, slip stitch into this first one and turn. But if you're doing the invisible join, I'm going to show you how to do that. I recommend keeping this stitch marker in just so then that way you don't have to try to find that stitch later. And so we're going to just kind of use it to stretch that part open there. And we're going to go behind everything, go into that stitch. We'll do our, making sure stitch marker is out of the way there. We'll do our hook over our yarn, pull it through everything on there. Once we do that, we're then going to need to make sure we take our old set A stitch marker here and we're going to put it in that center stitch of the increase we just made. So these 3 stitches here, find that center one, go ahead and put it in there. And once you do that, you are now finished with your second round and all of your set A increases. Now that we have joined and turned and finished round 2, we are ready to begin round 3. So round 3 and every odd numbered round going forward is going to be on the right side and they're going to just be non-increase rounds. So that just means we'll work seed stitch pattern all the way around. We're not going to do any increasing in these marked stitches. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that now that we have flipped over, we're actually going to be doing the opposite of what we started on the previous round. So the previous round started with a back loop, half double crochet for our seed stitch, and we ended with our increase in the third loop. So that means when we flip it around, it's going to look like it's towards the back. So we need to actually begin by working in this front. So we're going to actually start every odd numbered round in the third loop. So we will yarn over, find our first stitch here, and we will go through that third loop, yarn over, pull up our loop, and pull through all 3. And then the next one we will encounter will be this one right here. So we will go ahead and take that marker out, work our back loop, half double crochet, and then we want to make sure we put that stitch marker right back in to remind us that that's where the set A increase is going to continue going. And then we will work at the next one in the third loop. Now, working across those increases like that, it's kind of hard to exactly tell, is it really doing much of a difference doing the back loop, third loop thing? But then once we start getting to these stitches here, we can start seeing a bit of a pattern. We can see that this stitch right here, which is these legs of this stitch kind of coming out, is coming more towards the front. So that reminds us, hey, we actually need to work this into the back. Then when we look at the next one, we can see that this is the top of the stitch. And then the legs, we can barely even see them. They're tucked way back here. So it looks like it's almost floating above this space right here. Well, that tells me that that was worked in the back. So now I need to work in the front. So we're going to go into this third loop here. So every time you're working the seed stitch, you can actually find that you've got some of these where you're like, okay, it's easy to tell. You've got this part right here that's towards the front. And then this one looks like it's just kind of floating on top and just coming out of here without any legs. That reminds us we've got to do back loop. And then third loop. So that's just a trick for if you're ever like, wait a minute, which one did I just work and what do I need to work next? You can always just try to find where is the top of that stitch connected? Is it coming to the front or is it going into the back? Another way I like to think of it is that when I work my back loop one, I do have to go back there. But when I work my front loop one, it's very easy just to kind of slip into that gap and go under that third loop now that we have our established stitch pattern. So if I tried to work a front loop into this one or a third loop one into this one, it's a little bit trickier to get into because this part of the post is actually kind of blocking our way of getting into it. So I have to struggle a bit more to go into that third loop. Whereas this one, there's no struggle. I just slip it right in because there's no post of the stitch getting in the way. So those are just a couple of little tips and tricks on how to do the seed stitch and make sure that you're working the correct stitch into the one below. And if it ever feels like, hey, I'm just not really understanding where I'm supposed to put the stitch, maybe just go back and start over and be like, okay, so I started, this round front loop, then I went back, front, back, front, back, front, so on and so forth. So every time you work into a marked stitch, you can remember, oh, I worked that loop. So here, I'm about to work a front loop. And then I'm about to work a back loop into this marked stitch. So if I remember that this back loop, this set B1 is a back loop stitch, then I know counting from there, I should go back, front, back, front, back, front, etc., etc. So if I need to, I can go back and see where did I last leave off and so on and so forth. And it's trial and error. It's figuring it out. Even when I was first working with this stitch, I wasn't always clear exactly where my back loop and front, the third loop were, but I eventually was able to figure it out. And so I wanted to pass those kinds of things that I figured helped me onto you. So that's essentially all you do for seed stitch on all of the odd numbered rounds. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that up. And then I will join you back for round 4 to show you working in the set B stitch marker increases. All right, I've gone ahead and started round 4 because starting round 4 is the same as when you start round 2. The only difference here is going to be that as I work across, instead of working my increases in the set A stitch markers, I'm actually going to be working them in the set B stitch markers. So if I remember, my set B stitch markers are these plasticky ones. When I get to this very first stitch marker, I am going to work an increase. So now that I've reached here, I've worked the third loop one. So this one is going to be where I start with a back loop increase. So as a reminder, back loop increase, you're going to go through the back loop first, followed by working into the third loop of that same stitch. And then working into the back loop of that same stitch again. Oh, actually, I accidentally worked into a different one. Okay, there we go. Let's try again. Oh, wait, no, it was fine. Sorry, my bad. There we go. Okay. All right, there we go. So we've worked our back, front, and back. So I'm going to now pop my stitch marker back into that center stitch. Now, you may be wondering, why is it that we have these two sets of stitch markers? Why don't we just have the one set, work our increases in those same ones over and over again? And let me tell you why. It's because when you work the same increases into the same spot, it will actually create a shape that's not actually a perfect circle. So when we're working a circular yoke, one of the things we want to try to do is make it actually look round. Well, if we put them all in these same spots, like if I only did these set A stitch markers and just did those 3 increases, eventually this would not be a circle, it would actually form a triangle. So if I had my 12 increase points, it would look a little bit more rounded, but it's going to look more like a dodecahedron. So like one of those 12-sided figures. So it's going to have those distinct lines where we see the increases, and it's not going to give us that perfectly round look. So by doing the set A and the set B, it helps to kind of soften that. You don't have distinct lines of increase. It's going to be broken up every 4 rounds every single time, and they alternate. So it helps blend it a lot better. So that's really the reason why we do those set A, set B stitch markers. And if you wanted to and really like truly make it as blended as possible, you could also even do like a set C and a set D stitch marker set if you really wanted to go super crazy and like put some more in between. But I personally would be like, yeah, it's a little much for me. I don't think it's necessary to go that far. But if it is something you would be interested in trying, feel free. I'm not going to stop you. I'm just going to be like, yeah, no, that's going to be too hard even for me. But yeah, there we go. That is just my reasoning behind doing the set A and set B stitch markers. That being said, however, if for some reason you find working set A, set B confusing, you're like, oh, I just keep forgetting which one I'm supposed to work in, and so on and so forth, then you can forego doing that and go ahead and just work set A stitch marker increases, because while mine would form a triangle, yours is going to form that dodecahedron. It's still going to be rounded looking. It's just going to be a little bit, less round looking than if you did the set A, set B. So that's really up to you. Whatever works easiest for you. You'll get the same number of increases. You'll have the same stitch counts. You'll have the same round counts. So it won't impact any of that. The only thing it will change is the style of your yoke when you're done. All right, now with all of that, you pretty much have all the information you need to work the first part of this yoke with all of its increases. So I'm going to go ahead and work up a few more rounds of this, and then I will get back to you to talk to you about the part 2 when we need to adjust our stitch markers. Okay, so I've worked a few more rounds on my little sampler here. Now, because you'll be doing the actual full-size sweater, it is going to be a lot flatter than this, but mine is just, puckered and everything. But you can still see that I've got all these stitch markers still in here, and I'm now done working my last increase round. Now, for some of the sizes, there's going to need to be one more kind of in-between increase to kind of just get it to the right stitch count. And what that'll tell you for your size is just to work in every other set A or set B stitch marker, depending on what you're in. Literally all that means is, so for instance, if I'm on an increase round and it's to work in every other set A stitch marker, I would skip all the set Bs, work my first set A stitch marker increase, then work a regular one in the next set A, but then work another increase in the next set A stitch marker, and then eventually just keep alternating, and then you'll end in the set A stitch marker without an increase. Or you could do it the other way around, where you're like, okay, I'm going to skip an increase in the first set A stitch marker, work it in the second one, skip the third one, work in the fourth one, skip the fifth one, work in the sixth one, so on and so forth. In either case, you're basically decreasing the number, or you're reducing the number of increases by half because we needed to get it up to a certain stitch count. But once you basically do all those increases, the next thing we're going to have to do is actually shift our stitch markers a bit, because the first part of the yoke is supposed to go out over the shoulders. So that's going to be a much more dramatic and fast increase. But then as it goes over the shoulders, it's going to be a much more gentle decrease. So the increase. So the increases are not going to happen as rapidly. So we need to actually get rid of some of these stitch markers. So in the pattern, it'll say the first step is to get rid of every set B stitch marker. So we're going to go through all of our set B stitch markers, and we will remove them just like so. And that will leave us with 12 set A stitch markers. So we had 24 stitch markers plus the beginning of round, and now we're down to 12 stitch markers plus the beginning of round. Now what we need to do is in every other set A stitch marker, we're going to replace it with a set B. So it doesn't really matter how you want to do this, just as long as you make sure that you're basically replacing every other one with a set B so that they'll alternate again between A and B like they did before. There's just going to be a lot more space between them. So for me, I might be like, okay, so this is the first one. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that as a set A stitch marker. But then in the very next one, I'm going to remove that set A stitch marker and replace it with a set B stitch marker. Just like that. Then the next one, I will keep the set A stitch marker, and then in the next one, replace that one with a set B stitch marker. And then I just keep doing that all the way around until I get to the very last one. And the last one should be the one that we replace, or as long as you just make sure you go through and just be like, okay, it keeps alternating between set A and set B until the very end of my round, you'll be good. And then that'll reduce the number of increase points by half. Once you do that, the rest of the instructions for the yoke are exactly the same as the ones we did for this first part of the yoke. There's no difference in like the way of doing increase or anything like that. It's just a matter of how often you increase, like which round you work on to do the increases, so on and so forth. But you're still continuing the seed stitch pattern. You're still working your increases alternating between set A and set B stitch markers all the way until you get to the end of the yoke. So I'm just going to work up a few rounds here just to kind of give me a little bit more space. And then I will join you for the next part when we actually need to set up to split for the sleeves and body. All right, so I have worked up some and not very much, but it's just to kind of give you an idea on this sample. And one of the first things that you'll do when we transition into splitting for the body and the sleeves is we go ahead and remove all of our set A and set B stitch markers, leaving our beginning of round ones. And you might be wondering, okay, well then what are these stitch markers you put? Well, I'm glad you asked. The reason I still have these in here is because what I did is after I removed all the stitch markers, I then pulled 4 of them back in because I counted out the number of stitches that I will need to work that's listed in my pattern for my size before I have to skip for my sleeves. So the way that this will work is that we will work a certain number of stitches around the back. We'll be halfway across the back of our sweater. Then we're going to chain a few in order to get under the underarm. Skip all of these stitches here, which I've marked off with these stitch markers, and then begin working again across here, and that will create the opening for our sleeve and continue working around the front of the body. Then we get around to here and we do the same thing where we will work until this stitch mark stitch, chain some, skip all of these stitches, then begin working and finish out the rest, and that will set aside the sections for our sleeves and our body. Now at this point, you can customize the placement of where you want your sleeves. In the pattern, the way I have it designed is that the back number of stitches is slightly less than the front number of stitches to give a little bit more room in the chest and a little bit less in the back. Because for me, I know that my chest needs more room than my back does, and I feel like a lot of people, that's the case. Our chests tend to be a little bit more protruded than our back. However, I also understand that for some people, they might need more room around the back than they do around the front. And so if you need to, you can always adjust where the number of stitches falls, as long as you keep those sleeve stitches the same and you just move them evenly around, you should be able to adjust very nicely for your back and your front. Now, the next thing to note is that when we work this row or this part, this round, when we're working our stitches, we're no longer working in this seed stitch pattern. Now in the written pattern, I do give instructions for what to do if you do want to continue working the seed stitch. If you really like it and you want the whole sweater worked in that way, you can go for it. I'm not going to be showing all of that on here because I want to show just like the standard way that I've written it for. But if you want to, you can go ahead and choose to do that. But the very first thing we're going to do is actually work our half double crochets in the back loop only. So working into the back loops of my stitches, I'm just going to half double crochet. And regardless of whatever the seed stitch was before, I just work the back loop in all of these. Now, the reason that we want to do this is because it gives a nice clean transition between our yoke with this seed stitch pattern, and then it'll create this ridge, and then we will move into our regular half double crochet pattern for the remainder of the sweater. So it just sets this apart and gives that nice clean transition line here with this ridge. So that's why we work this round entirely in the back loop only, and we no longer work in that seed stitch pattern. So what we do as we're working across is we will work until we reach our first stitch marker, or if you're just counting, you work until you reach the number of stitches in your pattern for your size. And then once we reach where we are going to stop working our stitches, we are then going to chain the number of underarm chains that we need for our underarm. Now that's going to differ based on size preferences. So the smaller sizes, you're going to have a shorter chain. Larger sizes, you'll have a longer one. But actually, this is a perfect time for you to add some more customization so that you know, okay, well, if I make a longer chain, I can actually increase the circumference around the sleeve and the circumference around the chest, and I can adjust that if you need like maybe slightly more room or slightly less room than what is set in the pattern. So for instance, if you know, okay, I picked to work the 1X, and I know that the 1X uses like, 6 chains to be able to skip, and I'm like, but I know that I want it to be slightly roomier, but I didn't want to go all the way up to the 2X, you can make that chain bigger, like maybe doing 10 chains, and that will help increase and give you a little bit more room without having to go all the way up to the next size. So this allows some customization. But for this sample, I'm just going to go ahead and work 6 chains. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then once we work those 6 chains, I'm going to come all the way over to this side, past my stitch marker here, skipping all of my sleeve stitches, and I'm going to start working my half double crochets in the back loop into this next stitch. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is kind of push our chain over here. We want to make sure we're not stretching and warping everything. We're going to fold it to where it's right in front of us. We're going to do our yarn over, and we're going to hold that in place with our finger. And then we're going to insert into the back loop of that stitch that we're about to work into next, keeping a hold of our loops that were on our hook so that they're not sliding and stretching. Yarn over, pull up a loop, then keeping hold of those, yarn over and pull through those 3. And that helps keep that half double crochet we just worked nice and close so it's not super big and loose. And then that chain stretches across here and forms that armhole opening for our sleeve. Then once we do that, we just continue working in the back loop only of every half double crochet across the front of our sweater. And once we get all the way across the front here, we'll reach the other side where we will just repeat exactly the same thing we just did back here, where I'm going to chain the same number of chains. And then I'm going to skip all of the stitches for the sleeves. And then in this next stitch, we're going to work a half double crochet in the back loop. So we will hold our loop, yarn over, get nice and close to it, and then insert through that back loop, pull up our loop, holding our stitch nice and close, yarn over and pull through all 3 of those loops. And I've got my second sleeve made right here. And there we go. And then we just continue in pattern, working the back loop only half double crochets and doing our invisible join at the very end. And then we will have split our yoke into the sleeves and the body sections. So what I'm going to do now is finish this part up off camera, and then I'm going to turn and work the next round and show you how to work across the underarm chains. Now all of our body rounds from here on out are just worked in regular half double crochet. So we're not working in the back loop or the third loop or anything like that. We're just making sure we're going through both loops of our stitch and through the front. So it's just a normal half double crochet in each stitch. And then when I get here close to the underarm, sometimes it can be a bit difficult to tell where I'm supposed to end my half double crochets and then work into the chains. So one thing to point out is that we know the number of chains that we worked. And if we flip over to where we were working before when we created the chain, and we can see these kind of top loops right here, these V's that we were working. The last half double crochet I made was this one that was right here. And so the loop that was used to create that was this loop right here. So that's going to indicate that that's that last half double crochet to work in. So then my first chain is not that V right there. It's going to be the next one after that. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is the last chain that was right there. So then the first half double crochet would have been worked here. So what I've done is I've worked my last half double crochet here, and now I'm ready to begin working into the chains themselves. Now it's up to you how exactly you want to work into the chain. I know some people like to work in the back hump. They like to work under 2 loops, just 1 loop, whatever you want to do. But the point is that you just work across these stitches like you would if you made like a foundation chain in crochet. So we're going to yarn over. I personally prefer like to just going through this top loop right here. So I'm just going to go through this top loop, and that counts as my first stitch right here. So there's 1. And then I'll go into the next one, which kind of tightened up a bit here, but I can see that it's that one right there. So there's 2. And then my next one is going to be this one right here. So there's 3. And then we have 4, 5, and 6. And now that means that the next stitch I work into should be my half double crochet stitches. So, oh, actually, I kind of got that backwards. This was actually the top of my stitch that I worked here, because it's this stitch right here. Well, no worries, it is okay, because the point is that the number of V's is still going to be the same. So as long as I did my 6 stitches here, I can start working into this next stitch, and that will be the next half double crochet that I need to work, followed by this next one here. And then I should be able to continue working half double crochets like normal. Once I'm finished working across the chains and I just start working regular half double crochet, I do that exact same thing when I reach the other side under the other arm. So I'm just going to keep working half double crochets around, work my half double crochets in each chain across the underarm, and then finish off by working half double crochets around to the end, invisible join, and turn. Once I do that, I will be ready for the next part, which is going to be decreasing around the chest area to cinch it in from the yoke down to the regular chest width. Once we've worked our entire split setup here, we are going to now have our body to start working, and we're going to just ignore these sleeve openings for now. We will be joining and working those later. But one thing to note is that this pattern, the way it's designed is that the yoke is done in this seed stitch and the rest of the body is done in the regular half double crochets. In the pattern, I do list that there are 2 gauges. The heights are going to be the same basically, but the widths are going to be where you're going to have differences. So the seed stitch cinches in a lot, so you need a lot more of these stitches to get around. But once you get to your regular half double crochet, you don't need as many. Unfortunately, this means if we kept the same stitch count, it's going to do this kind of ballooning effect where the chest and waist are going to come outward and get rid of that nice sleek design that we're wanting. So what I've done to accommodate for this is we're actually going to do a few decrease rounds to get the body down to the shape that we need it to be to continue with our sweater. So to work those, all you simply do is work half double crochets like normal until you reach a certain number of stitches before the underarm. And the underarm is just those chains that we worked across. So the stitches that we worked across there, you can kind of just eyeball where that's going to be. It doesn't have to be exact, but if you just kind of find where you're about that many stitches away from the underarm, you're going to work until you have that many left. So in this case, I'm going to say that I need to work until I have 6 stitches left. We'll go ahead and do that. There we go. Okay. So now when I work until I have about however many it tells me to, it's then going to tell me to work a number of half double crochet decreases across these. So the half double crochet decrease I like to use is one that's a little bit more of like an invisible one. So rather than doing a traditional half double crochet decrease where we yarn over, insert, pull up loop, and then yarn over, insert, pull up loop, and then complete it, to me that adds too much bulk. So we're going to do kind of a modified amigurumi one, which is those kinds that they use in like those stuffed toys that you've seen people crochet. So what we're going to do is we'll yarn over like we do for our normal half double crochet. Then in this next stitch, we're instead of going through both of the loops, we're actually only going to go through the front loop of this stitch, just like so. But we're not going to yarn over or pull up any loops. Instead, we're going to now turn our hook and then insert it into both loops of the next stitch. So we've entered the front loop of the first stitch and then both loops of the second stitch all at the same time. Then we're going to yarn over and pull through that stitch that we entered the second time and the front loop of the stitch we entered the first time. And it kind of pulls those two stitches together and kind of fills that gap a bit while pulling this front loop over. Now we've got our regular half double crochet and we can just finish it like normal. And that creates a decrease, but the size of our stitch hasn't changed. It's still just a regular half double crochet. We don't have any extra random loops that we've added to it. All we've done is just kind of moved where it's placed and kind of tugged this first stitch a little over to here to fill in that gap. And then we just do that again into the next two. So we'll yarn over, go through the front loop of this stitch, and then turning our hook, we're going to go through both loops of the next stitch, yarn over, pull up our loop through both of those stitches there. Then we will yarn over and pull through all 3 to finish our half double crochet. And then we just repeat that again, and you'll just do that until it tells you the number of decreases. I believe it actually is 3 for all the sizes. I think I just did it that way to make it easy. Here we go. So go through the front loop and then both loops of the next one. Pull a loop through the stitches, then yarn over, pull through 3. And there we go. So what that's done is it's decreased the number of stitches on this part under the arm by 3. So each one of those decreased by 1, and you did it 3 times. So there's 3 stitches taken out. Then we will just work across the underarm just like normal. So for me, it was 6 stitches across. So now we just work 6 regular half double crochets, or however many it is for your size for your underarm. Once I work across the underarm, I should now be to the other side, and we're going to repeat that exact same set of decreases that we did over here. So we're evenly decreasing on both sides of the underarm. So here again, we're going to yarn over, find our next stitch, work under that front loop. Then turning my hook, getting into both loops of the next stitch, yarning over, pulling through both of those stitches, then yarn over and pull through all 3, and then just do that 2 more times. Once we have those decreases done, we can now go ahead and work across the other stitches, and then we just repeat that the exact same way underneath the other arm. So now that I've shown you how to do that, you should know how to do the rest of this round. So now to give you a roadmap of what to look forward to. Once we do that set of decreases, depending on your size, it's then going to tell you, okay, so then you'll work another round without any decreasing. Then you'll work another round of decreasing, and you'll just keep alternating between doing this decrease and then just doing regular half double crochets. And you'll do it however many times it says for your size. So I know for the smaller sizes, you only have to do this maybe like 3 times. For some of the larger sizes, it goes up to 6 times. But once you get to the end of that, you'll have all the decreases you need, and it will cinch this in to prevent that ballooning effect. So it's not going to angle it in like this. What it's going to do is take it from being this shape, and it's going to kind of help straighten it back out to here. So once you do that part, you're then ready to begin the remainder of your body. I wanted to take a moment to show you what I'm talking about so you can kind of see the result on a full-size version of your sweater. So I've got my sample that I'm working up here. I've already finished the yoke, and I've already started the body down here. And over here, you can kind of see it where we've got these decreases over here underneath the arms. So if I kind of spread it here, you can see that I started off with my normal stitch count, but then I started doing the decreases here, and that helped kind of cinch it in so that the body, rather than coming out, which as you can see, it was going to start doing if I kept going, it was like kind of angling this way. But once I did the decreases, it brought it in, and now the body is going straight down instead of being over here where it would be kind of this balloon effect. It brings it inwards so that it lines up more with the top of the shoulder of our sweater. So it keeps that silhouette nice and straight. So I just wanted to kind of show you that to let you know this is why we do that decrease. So now that we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about how to start doing the body, and if you want to, how to do waist shaping if you do want to bring it in for a more tapered look. Okay, so I'm ready to work the body on my little sample here. And so if you wanted to do just a straight waist, you don't have to do any sort of special thing. All you do is just literally work half double crochet rounds over and over and over for the number of rounds that it lists for your size. Or if you need it to be longer or shorter, you can adjust by adding and subtracting rounds as needed. But if you want a tapered waist, so you take your sweater and you want it to kind of come inward so that it narrows at the waist and gives you a much more inverted triangle look, then what you'll want to do is do decreases on the sides of the waist at even spaces. So based on the number of rounds that I give for each size, I've already calculated out when you need to be doing decreases. But of course, if you do adjust the number of rounds, you will want to squeeze those increase or decreases in or spread them out a bit more, which you can kind of do by being like, okay, if I add, like 10 more rounds or something like that, then I need to probably space out maybe like one extra round in between each one, or maybe just like the last ones, or just do the decreases and then the last 10 rounds, you just go straight down. In either case, what you're going to do is the same if you want that waist. So what I do is go ahead and locate my underarm, and then you just kind of locate a center stitch. It's not going to be perfectly centered because they're all even number chains, but I'm going to go ahead and grab a stitch marker here, and I just place it around the center under the arm, just to give me a mark there. Then I do the same thing on the opposite side. I locate the underarm here, and I find where the center is, and I'll just mark a center stitch. And there we go. Once I do that, I will then, following the instructions, work a certain number of non-decrease rounds. So it might say like, work 6 rounds and then work in a decrease round, or work 8 rounds and then a decrease round, depending on your size. But in either case, you'll work however many non-decrease rounds that you need to do. And then on the decrease round, you're going to work until you have 2 stitches remaining before your first stitch marker. Okay, so I now have 2 stitches left before my stitch marker. So I'm going to perform my first decrease. So this is very similar to what we did up here under the arms. We're just going to do it once here instead of 3 times. So we're going to yarn over, go through the front loop of my first stitch, then both loops of my second one, pull up a loop through both of those there, then yarn over, pull through all 3. Then in my marked stitch, I'm just going to work a regular half double crochet. And then I'm going to put that stitch marker right back in there because that will act as kind of our center stitch that forms that line that's going to go down the side of our sweater. And now that we're on the opposite side, we're going to do one more decrease across these next 2. So we'll then do a yarn over, go through the front loop of this first stitch. If I can get it in there. There we go. And then through both loops of the next stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop through those stitches, yarn over, pull through 3. And that's really all there is to doing the decreasing for the waist shaping. It's just working to 2 stitches before the stitch marker, do the decrease, work a regular half double crochet, and then work a decrease on the other side. Then you just half double crochet around and do it again on the opposite side with the other stitch marked stitch. And then after you do your next set of non-decrease rounds, you just repeat that again and just keep moving the stitch marker down, and you'll slowly see the waist start to come inward. You could even change how dramatic the increase is. So if you wanted to extension really tightly for your really narrow waist, then you just need to add in more increase rounds. So if you're like, rather than working 6 rounds of non-decrease and then 1 of decrease, you could do maybe 4 rounds of decrease and 1 of decrease. Just, it's up to you. Just insert them wherever you feel like. If you feel like you don't want the waist to taper in too much, you can actually eliminate some of the decrease rounds. So instead of doing 6 rounds and then 1 decrease round, you could do maybe 12 rounds and then a decrease round, or 13 rounds and then a decrease round, I think is what it would be. Or in other words, you could just drop every other decrease round until the end, and then that'll give you a more gradual shift to a slightly narrowed waist instead of the more dramatic one. So that's where you can customize, is just how often you want to decrease your rounds. But once you do, all you do is basically just work your body around and around and around and around. It's going to be one of the longer parts that you will work. And once you do, you're going to have your nice long sweater body. And then once you do that, we will be ready to begin the next part, which will be the bottom ribbing. I've just now finished working up the body of my sweater. So I've got my yoke done, all my body rounds and everything. And I'm now ready to begin the bottom part, which is going to be the hem ribbing. But also this is going to be the exact same technique you do when you work the cuff ribbing around the ends of the sleeves. So I'm going to be showing you this technique, and you'll just use this same part to look at both if you need help with either one. So the first thing we're going to do is, once we're done with our final round, and if you made any adjustments, always make sure you end on a wrong side round so that when we turn, we're on the right side. We're going to switch from our C hook to our B hook, or whichever hook you were using for the smaller one, for that tighter ribbing. If you find that you don't really want that tighter ribbing and you'd rather just continue with your current hook, you can do that as well. But in either case, the method is going to be the same. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and chain the number that it states in our pattern, or however many we want to get the length of the hem or cuff that we want. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and chain 13. So there's 1, 2, 3. Okay. And then we're going to kind of tighten down that last chain there. And in the second chain from our hook, we're going to do a half double crochet. And then a half double crochet in every chain across. And for me, since I did 13 chains, that's going to give me 12 chains because of that turning chain there at the end. You'll notice probably that this is the exact same way that we started our collar ribbing at the top of our sweater. And that is true. That's the exact same type of ribbing we're doing here. So this part of it is exactly the same as when we started our neck collar. But there's going to be a difference when we get here to the bottom of the sweater, because we're going to be working what's called a join as you go band. And what that means is rather than creating a separate ribbing like we did when we made the neck ribbing, we're actually going to create it and join it at the same time so that we don't have to seam or sew anything on when we're done. All right, I'm coming now. Here's my final one. And there we go. That is 12 stitches. Now, half double crochet ribbing takes up 1.5 times the height, like the width of a stitch. Essentially, is kind of the rule that we go with when it comes to doing a join as you go. So what that means is that for every 2 rows, I'm going to need to have 3 stitches joined. So what I'm going to do is we've already worked this row here, which is going to account for this first stitch of our bottom of our hem here. So I'm actually going to skip that one and work into the next one and go slip stitch into that stitch. So there's one. Then I'm going to slip stitch into the second one, and then slip stitch into the third one. Because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my work, and because I'm already joined to the bottom, all I have to do is now start working back out half double crochets in the back loop. So we're going to yarn over, and we're going to skip those slip stitches that we just worked. So those are just to join to the bottom. So there's 1, 2, 3. So my very first stitch is this one right here. That's going to be the one where I work my back loop, half double crochet, followed by working back loop, half double crochets all the way across. All right. So I've worked all of my stitches across. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and turn, and then I'm going to work my next row of half double crochets. So the reason we had to do 3 slip stitches is because we're working 2 rows. We're working one down to the end and then one back up to the join. So that's why we do those 3. So that accounts for those 1.5 per row. So then what we'll do is we'll chain 1 to get our turning chain here. And then we'll yarn over, work in the back loop only of our half double crochet. Just work another row of half double crochets. And there we go. And then what I do is I see that, okay, so this was the one that we last slip stitched into earlier. So we're going to move to the next one, and we're going to work slip stitches into the next 3 stitches along our bottom. So there's 1 slip stitch, 2, 3. And then I turn, and then I just repeat those steps over and over and over again. And I do that all the way around the bottom of my sweater or along the edge of my sleeves to create the cuffs. And so you just keep doing that back and forth. That's going to take me a while, so I'm going to go ahead and work mine off camera. But once I'm done, I'm going to get all the way here close to the end, and I'm actually going to show you what to do in case you don't have exactly 3 stitches left before we get to the very beginning of our ribbing. I have just now finished working my ribbing up all the way around the bottom, and I only have a few more stitches left. So I want to talk to you about what to do when you get here towards the end before we do our join. So for some sizes, or like if you did any kind of adjustments to the sizing on the stitch count, you may or may not end up with exactly 3 stitches left at the end. If you do end up with exactly 3 stitches, all you do is just work those 3 slip stitches, work 2 more rows of ribbing, and then you're ready to do the join. But if you wind up working around and you find you've worked 3 stitches and you have 2 stitches left or 4 stitches left, you just have to adjust how you do your slip stitching. So all you do if you have 4 stitches left is we're going to just slip stitch in the next 2 instead of the next 3. So I'm going to go into these next 2. And then I'll turn and work my half double crochets, because that's not going to make a huge difference if we do that in just this last part by doing only those 2 slip stitches rather than the 3. And just doing it on these last 2, it's not a big deal. So I'll go ahead and just work that up. This time making sure instead of skipping 3, I'm skipping those 2 slip stitches, and then doing my half double crochets in the back loop. And then once I get back here, I see that I now have these 2 stitches left. I had this stitch marker marking my very last stitch just so it's easy for me to find. And so if you're working around and you find you work 3 and then you have these last 2 left, you just do exactly the same thing as I did. I just happen to have 4, and I just wanted to show you both examples. So then all we do is go ahead and I'll take that stitch marker out here, find these last 2 stitches, and go ahead and just slip stitch into both of those. And then I'll turn, work my row of half double crochet back loop only and row of half double crochet back loop only back. And then I'll show you what to do the join. All right, I've just finished my very last row and I'm ready to start doing the joining. So to do the joining, the first thing I'll actually do is find the first stitch that we would have had in this round. And I go ahead and just slip stitch into that round just to get the top of this row attached to the bottom of our sweater. And then what I'm going to do is take my yarn and keep it to the back there, but I'm going to take this last row and lay it over the first row here, the chains that we worked into, just like we did when we joined the neck ribbing to form the collar. We're going to do exactly that same joining to get that kind of seamless look where all the ridges of our ribbing look like they just keep going around and around. So to do this, what I'm going to do is, keeping my yarn to the back, we're going to locate our very first stitch. So that's going to be this one right here. It was on the last row. And we're going to just insert our hook through both loops of that stitch. And then going through the first chain or first loop or the bottom of this first stitch here on the first row, we're going to insert our hook through that one as well. Again, there we go. All right. And then I'm going to just slip stitch all of that together. So I'm going to yarn over, pull my yarn through all of those chains, those stitches, those loops, everything like that. And I can keep that fairly tight because we're not going to be working back into those. And that'll give us a nice clean looking rib effect. Okay, so now that I've done that, I've done one stitch. I'm going to now do it into the second one. So I'll find my second stitch here, go through both loops of that second stitch on the last row, find the next free loop here. So I've worked into this one. So I'm going to work into this next one as my second one from the first row. And then I'm going to yarn over and slip stitch through everything. And you just match stitch for stitch, doing that all the way across to join. So if you did 12 stitches, then you would have 12 joining slip stitches. If you did 18, you would have 18. If you expanded it to 24 or something like that, you just do it exactly like that. Now, as you go, you're going to try to do your best to make sure you line up each stitch as close as you can. But if you don't get it exact, it's not perfectly lined up, as long as you're only off by maybe 1, maybe 2 stitches, that's okay. You can always just kind of fudge what you need to. So for instance, if I ended up being like, oh no, I get towards the end and I'm out of stitches on the first row, but I still have maybe one more here, I just kind of like put the last 2 on this side into that last stitch. Or I might like work the second to last one into this stitch here and then the last one into this stitch here. So I might like put 2 through this second one and then 1 through this last one, something like that. But basically you just kind of make it work however you need to. Or if you are just an absolute perfectionist and you're like, no, it has to line up exactly, then that's up to you. Feel free, frog this entire ribbing join and start back over if you don't like the way that it looks. This is your project. You get to do what you need to make it look the way you want and for you to be happy with it. So for me, I just do my best to line it up as closely as possible. And if I find towards the end it's not exactly perfect, as long as it looks close enough, I'm happy with it. So I'm going to go ahead and finish slip stitching through all of these. All right, so I've got two more stitches to work. I've got this one and then this last one that always kind of tucks slightly to the side there. And I have exactly two more loops to go through. So it actually worked out really nicely. It was perfectly aligned. It just happened to work out for me. That's not always the case, but I'm very happy with that now. So I'm doing that last one or second to last one. And then now I'm in that last one, just getting under both of those loops and into this first stitch of my first row. And there we have it, this nice, beautiful, seamless looking join where the ribbing just looks like it continues all the way around. And the inside even looks like that as well. So we've got very nice, clean ribbing. So once we do that, we're able to just fasten off, pull our yarn through there. And then all we do is we would just take our yarn needle, tapestry needle, and we would just weave this in, helping maybe like close up any kind of like little gap that might be happening here, just to kind of tighten that up, and then just weave it in through here just to secure it. And then once you do that, you are now ready to begin working on your sleeves. To begin our sleeves, we are going to locate one of our sleeve openings. So you can do this on the right side, left side, it doesn't matter, but the instructions are going to be the same. So I went ahead and kept these stitch markers in here from when I did my split to remind me that these are the first and last stitches that join in the yoke. And then the ones that are in between here on the underarm, these were the underarm chains. So if I remember how many underarm chains I made, then that tells me the number of stitches that should be along this part. And I'm going to show you how to join here, work across here, and then work across around the yoke. So I'm going ahead and switching back to my size C 2.75 millimeter hook. And I'm just going to grab some yarn here. And I join by going ahead and making a slip knot. Place that on my hook. And then I find the stitch I need to join into and just do a slip stitch. So because I had 4 underarm chains, I know that my center stitches are going to be the middle 2. And because I'm going to be working right to left, since I'm right-handed, I'm going to join just to the left of that. So that's going to be my very first stitch. So I find these 4 stitches here in the middle. Looks like it's probably, I think, these 4. So I'm going to join into this one right here. And if it's not exact, as long as you get the same number of stitches along here, that's all that really matters. So I'll join with a slip stitch. Oh, my yarn just keeps wanting to grab itself there. Okay, there we go. So slip stitch to join and secure it there. And then once I do that, I'm going to go ahead and chain 1 just to make sure it doesn't get loose when I do this next part. So now what we're going to do is we're going to basically be working the half double crochet in pattern like we did when we did the bottom of the yoke to create the body. So I'm going to just work a half double crochet into this very first stitch that's on the underarm. And then I'm going to go ahead and put a stitch marker in this one to mark it as my first stitch of the round. There we go. Then I'm going to work across every chain until I get to the end of the chain. In this case, since I only chained 4, it basically is just these first 2 stitches. But then one thing that you'll note is that whenever you reach the end of the chain, you're going to have a huge gap between the stitch you just made and the first stitch under the yoke. So to deal with that, and to prevent a giant hole from forming in this little corner right here, we're actually going to be doing some yarn overs and pulling through loops just to kind of fill in this space. And I indicate that in the written pattern as well. And it works kind of almost like doing a half double crochet decrease, but I'll just show you here what that'll look like. And this part really, there's not an exact way to do it. You just kind of have to find what looks right to you. So what you're going to do is go ahead and yarn over like we're about to make a half double crochet. And then you just kind of find places along this gap area before the stitch and you're just going to insert your hook where it feels natural and just pull up a loop. You don't pull anything through what's on your hook already. Instead, you go to the next spot that seems like you need to pull in something. So this next little kind of thing that looks almost like a stitch here, I'm going to go ahead and insert my hook into there, pull up another loop. And then there's still kind of a space here before I reach my first stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and put one more loop somewhere here. Now I don't want to put it into maybe just this one loop, because if I do that, that might stretch it a bit more here. So I'll actually go underneath the one just underneath that one. So it's going under 2 loops. And so that way it's a little bit more solid, a little more secure. So I've pulled in all of these loops. Now, after I do that, I should be to my first stitch. Now, because we worked back loop only half double crochets to create this transition, I'm going to do the exact same thing along these stitches around the sleeve to indicate that that's the end of that yoke part. So in this next stitch, I'm going to work a half double crochet in the back loop only. So I'll go ahead and take my stitch marker out there. And because I already did my yarn over back here, I'm not going to need to do another yarn over. I just insert my hook into the back loop of that stitch there, yarn over and pull up a loop. And then with all those loops on my hook, I'm going to then yarn over and pull through every loop at once and just basically join them all together. And as you can see, we still have 3 stitches. So we've got our first stitch of the round, the second one we worked into the underarm chain, and now this one only has 1 V at the top. That is 1 stitch, but that 1 stitch covers this entire section here that would have otherwise been just a giant hole. So that helps close up that gap so we don't have to try to sew that up later. That's just a nice little technique to really just polish up your underarm on your sleeves. Now that we've done that though, we are ready to just start working regular half double crochets around the edge of our sleeve. So we go around to the next stitch here, and we're going to work a back loop only half double crochet. And then we just keep working half double crochets in the back loop only around the entire sleeve. And as you can see, that just continues that ridge effect from when we did that when we transitioned to the body, and it just continues along the sleeve edge as well. So it's going to create a nice clean line around the entire yoke, including around the body and the sleeves. So I'm going to go ahead and work up those stitches, and then I will meet you back to show you how to do that corner thing on the opposite side. All right, I'm coming now to my last stitch around the yoke part of the sleeve. So I'm about to work into that last one that I have marked here. So I'll go ahead and take that stitch marker out. Work my last back loop half double crochet. And now I should be over to where I'm about to work across this underarm chain again. So I've got my first stitch marked here. We can see that it is worked into this chain right here. So the 2 chains that are next to that, since I did 4, are the last 2 I need to work into. And just like before, we've got this big gap that we have to jump between the stitch that we just made and the chain we have to work into. So I'm going to basically repeat that same process that we did over here, just across this gap. So I'm going to go ahead and yarn over, since we're working half double crochets. And then I just locate the stitch I need to work into. So it's going to be this one right here. So I've got about 3 places again where I can insert my hook just to fill in that gap. So I'm going to go underneath let's say these 2 loops right here. I'm going to insert my hook under that, pull up a loop. Then into this next one that kind of looks like a stitch, I'll insert my hook there, pull up a loop again. And then into this gap right here, insert, pull up a loop. And then I should be to my first chain of these last 2 that I need to work. So then I insert into that first chain. And then I'll yarn over, pull up a loop. And then I yarn over and just pull through everything that's on my hook. And it accomplishes the exact same thing as I did on the other side. It creates one stitch that covers up this gap. Now that I've done that, I only have one more stitch to work here at the end. So I'll yarn over, go into that last chain, pull up my loop, and then because we are at the end of a round, we are going to do our invisible join into our first stitch here. So I'm going to go behind everything, come through the top of my first stitch there, grab with my hook over my yarn and just pull it through everything on my hook. And then what I like to do is I will then turn, and then once I work my very first stitch, I'll pop another stitch marker into that just so I know exactly what my first and last stitches are. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk to you about is decreasing. So for a sleeve, if you want to do a just straight sleeve, like a big loose sleeve, and then cuff it at the end and get it really tight and just make like kind of a balloon style, or if you just want big long loose sleeves, that's fine. But for this style of sweater, I really like to opt for the tapered sleeve. So that means it's going to start big around here to fit the biceps, and then it's going to narrow down to the wrist and create a very clean silhouette that's like just a nice fitted look. So to do that, we're actually going to have to do some decreasing along the underside of our arm. Now in your pattern, it's going to list out which rounds you're going to decrease on depending on your size so that you can decrease to the correct amount. But this is adjustable. So if you don't need the sleeve as long or you need the sleeve to be longer, you're going to need to also adjust your decreases. So my general rule for that is going to be if you take the number of decreases that I have in the pattern, if you want to, you can just take out some of those rounds. So maybe like instead of decreasing the 12 times it might tell you to, if you don't want it to decrease as much, you might do like 6 times, so only half of those. Or you may do like the first 2 decreases and skip the third one. Do the next 2, skip the third one. Do the next 2, skip the third one. That's going to be up to you to keep track of how you want to do that. But the goal is you want to try to get as evenly as possible. Like you want to distribute those decreases as evenly as possible. So you don't want to do like all your decreases here at the top and then suddenly have a very narrow forearm. That's not going to create that. That's not going to create a gradual decrease like we want. So I'm just going to show you what you do when it is a decrease round. So if you're working a non-decrease round, you're just going to work your half double crochet pattern back and forth like normal. But then on a decrease round, you're going to do the following. You're going to work just a regular half double crochet into the very first stitch of the round. Then across the next 2 stitches, you're going to work the half double crochet decrease. So we're going to yarn over. We're going to insert through that front loop again, like we did when we decreased on the sides there. And then we'll go through both loops of the next stitch, yarn over, pull through both of those, then yarn over, pull through 2. Then I just keep going, yarn over, go into the next stitch and just do a regular half double crochet, and then just work regular half double crochets all the way around until I get to my last 3 stitches of the round. Once I've made my way all the way around to my last 3 stitches, I'm going to decrease across these next 2. So I will yarn over, go through the front loop of this next stitch, and then through both loops of the next one after that, pull a loop through both of those, and then complete my half double crochet. And that will have decreased it by another stitch. And then I just work my final half double crochet in this last one. Finishing by doing my invisible join through the first stitch of the round. And then that will have decreased it by 2 stitches under the arm. And so I will just do that every time it tells me to get a decrease, and it'll slowly decrease the stitch count by 2 every time until we get it down to the wrist. Then once you work all the way down to the wrist, you're going to work the cuff exactly the same way that you worked the bottom ribbing. So if you need to, you can go back and rewatch that part to have help on the cuffs, but otherwise you have now all the steps that you need to be able to finish out your Eurus sweater. So I'm just going to finish mine up and I'll show you the final result and then talk to you about some final steps to finish it off. All right, and we are now done. So in order to finish off your sweater, what you're going to do is make sure you weave in any yarn ends, and then you are going to wash and possibly block it. I definitely recommend blocking any of your garments just so then that way you can make sure you even out all the stitches. As you can see here, I've made sure that my sweater is pinned to the measurements that I want, and that way it is shaped the way that I want to. I helped kind of even out some of these shoulder shapings here where the sleeve joins with it. And that way I get this nice smooth semicircular pattern in the yoke here, making sure the collar is shaped the way that I want it to be. And I made sure to line up the ribbing and things like that here. And then I flattened out the sleeves so then that way they were nice and pressed looking. And so they'll line up really nicely once it's done. But once you do that, after you've soaked it and blocked it and it dries, you are free to now wear it. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it very helpful. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe so you can keep up with future projects. And I hope you have a wonderful day.